Welcome to the 20th Hayley-Roxanna Crafts quick cross stitch video, where I share information, hints and tips on one area of cross stitch in a short video. In this video, I'm focusing on how to do colonial knots. Colonial knots are another embroidery stitch similar to French knots, and some cross stitchers will use them in place of French knots, as some find them easier to do, as getting the correct tension is less of an issue. Colonial knots and French knots don't look the same, but they are similar enough. However, French knots tend to be circular in shape, whereas colonial knots tend to be more oval in shape. And so they may not be a suitable substitute on some occasions, such as for the pupils of eyes, but they are a perfect substitute in many situations. Just as a reminder, this is how I show French knots on my charts. On other charts, they may be shown as just a dot. I always show mine in the colour they are to be made in, even on the black and white chart, and I will include information detailing the threads and where the French knots are if there are multiple areas they are used in on the chart and they are in multiple colours. Other designers may ask you to refer to a colour photo of the finished cross stitch in order to determine where the different colours are. I have never seen colonial knots purposefully used on a cross stitch chart, so I'm not sure how they would be identified differently to French knots if a designer were to use both. This is where it is important to check instructions carefully in case a designer ever intends colonial knots to be used, and they may have also used French knots in their design. Like with French knots, when adding colonial knots to your cross stitch, the first thing to consider is how many strands to use. The knots here were all made with a different number of strands. So I used one strand here, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. As you can see, the more strands used, the larger the knot is. If the designer has included French knots in their design, they will often specify how many strands to use. I would advise using the same number of strands if substituting the French knot for a colonial knot. But if you do need to decide for yourself, try out the different number of strands on a scrap piece of fabric and see what you prefer. This may even vary project to project, as well as being subject to your personal preference. I have decided to use 2 strands to demonstrate colonial knots. Like with French knots, to make a colonial knot, first you need to bring the needle up through your fabric where you want the knot to be. So this could be through a hole, or it could even be through the fabric itself, sort of in the middle of a square or between holes. It could be anywhere. I'm just going to use a hole just for ease of demonstrating. And at this point, you probably want to place your fabric down on a flat surface just to free up your hands, because you might find you'll need both of them to do your colonial knot. So if I zoom in slightly, so you'll be able to see what I'm doing. Okay, and the next thing you need to do is you need to make a loop of the thread to the right of where you brought the needle up, and then pop your needle through that loop. So I'm just going to make a loop just to the right there, like so, and then just put my needle through that loop. You now need to take the end of the thread over the needle and allow the free end to hang under the needle to form like a figure of 8 with the needle through both loops. So I take the end of my thread, pass it over there and just under, and as you can see you get like a figure of 8. I move my hands out the way and the needle is through both loops. Okay, you now need to insert the needle back into the fabric, and you want to do this close to where it came up, but not through the exact same hole. So like I did with my French knots, I try to do it so there is literally a strand of the fabric between where I came up and where I'm going down, like so. And then you need to pull the longer end of the thread to tighten the twists, but you need to take care that you don't pull too tight, like so. because if you pull it too tight, it will make it harder to get your needle back down. And then what I do is I just put my thumb on the end so I can lift my fabric back up. So I can pull the needle through whilst holding the 2 loops around like so. And there is the finished colonial knot. So I have demonstrated colonial knots on Aida fabric, but they are done in the same way on even weave or any other fabric. So should you use French knots instead of colonial knots? The short answer is it's down to personal preference. Like French knots, colonial knots can take some practice, but many find them easier, and so it is worth giving them a go, especially if you struggle with French knots. And as you can see here, there isn't a lot of difference between what they look like. So this is the colonial knot and this is a French knot. If you're finding it hard to pierce the fabric with the needle, if you need to do the knot through somewhere that's not the hole, or even just taking the thread back down through the fabric, you can always try using a sharper needle. And if all else fails and you find French knots and colonial knots are not for you, you can always substitute them with beads. If you have any questions about colonial knots, please pop them in the comments. And in next week's video, I will demonstrate petite stitches on Aida fabric.